we on?
You're running.
Oh, okay. Let's start.
We are cooking.
We're beginning to do the principle of double effect, some of its applications in the last class. The main thing with double effect is that you have to be very, very careful as to how you apply it, because it's very possible to misapply it and thereby come to the wrong conclusion. And also you have to be very careful not to confuse it with the utilitarian, dare I say, principle that the end justifies the means. And many people say, I'm using double effect because I'm using a means to get to a good end, and therefore it's good. And after all, if I want the end, it's got to be good. And of course, that's not double effect. You can never use an immoral means to get to a good end. So in applying the four principles, and again, let's take a quick look at them just so we remember what we're talking about here.
Page 8.
I don't
No,
know.
9.
You have to find the page.
Page
9B, 9 section B here. The act itself must be good or neutral, cannot be evil. And remember, we have to keep in mind when you talk about an act, something like removing a gangrenous leg, formally you are removing the disease, materially you're sawing like mad. See? Materially, what you're doing is grossly physical. But formally, now we have to be careful. We say what I'm intending can't be referring to the end. You're referring to what is it I am doing at this moment. What am I attending to? What am I intending to do by this act of sawing? I am in one and the same act removing the disease. That is my intention. Materially, I'm sawing like mad, which of course results in the leg coming off. And remember, you can't rejoice in the fact that you've crippled someone in the process. That's not allowed, however tempting it may be. So the act itself must be good. Both effects flow directly from the act, and certainly the evil is not to be viewed as a means to the good. The good effect alone can be intended. So you can't rejoice in the evil. That's what I meant when I said you can't be happy the person no longer can walk with 2 legs. And there has to be a due proportion between the good effect and the evil effect, such that the good effect at least equals or exceeds the degree of the evil effect. So bearing that in mind, we look at a new example on page 10, which is the act of removing a uterine cancer. Now the presumption is you're dealing with a woman who is pregnant. The act, again, very much like removing a gangrenous leg, you are removing the cancer in excising the uterus. The surgeon removes the uterus. What he is doing is removing the cancer. Formally, that is his intention, to remove the cancer. Materially, it entails removing the uterus, which is cancerous. 2 results occur. 1, saving the life. It's parallel to amputating a leg. And the side effect that is lost, the side effect that is permitted but not willed, is the loss of fertility, because a woman won't be able to have another child. And if the woman is pregnant, it may entail the loss of the child's life, but there is a due proportion because you're dealing with 2 lives, the life of the woman and the life of the child. You can't say one life is preferable to another. Remember, you can't act on the basis of I'm going to save this life as opposed to that one because one is more valuable than the other. This is not a licit way of looking at things. We must distinguish between what we will and what we permit. And that, of course, is very, very important. We will the removal of the cancer. We will the saving of the person's life. we permit the loss of fertility, we permit the loss of the child's life. But that's why you can remove the uterus, which is cancerous, but you could not directly attack the unborn child and dissect it in the process of removing the uterus. That would be to directly attack the child, and you can't do that. So that what you're dealing with here is an indirect effect. You have to choose the cause for the good effect, not for the indirect effect. In other words, you're choosing the cause, which is to remove the uterus, for the good effect of saving the woman's life. And you're not choosing it for the indirect effect, which is the loss of the child's life, perhaps, in the process. We have to always distinguish the act itself from the effect of the act. And this is why it gets complicated. In some cases, you wind up scratching your head for a while trying to figure out exactly what is what here. So it's sort of, and that's why many times people get very confused by the application of double effect. The supreme principle is always that we do good and we seek good and we avoid evil. And that's what you're doing in the case of double effect. You're acting for the good. You're seeking the good. You're doing something that is good. You permit evil to occur, but you never act directly for it. So we're always seeking the good, we're always acting toward being. We're trying to maximize being. Ethics always maximizes being. We're always seeking the greatest possible good, but not in a utilitarian fashion, not like Bentham or Mill, where they would seek the greatest good for the greatest number and use evil means to attain it. That we cannot do. As in the case, sometimes people say, well, in the case of an unborn child, it represents a threat to the mother, and therefore, just like any other threat, you can ward it off by self-defense and therefore kill it. Well, that's not the case, because the unborn child simply is there. The child isn't doing anything. In the case of self-defense, well, that would be the next example I would like to look at. In the case of self-defense, what we're talking about is an act whereby you protect, let's say, your own right to life. And in principle, you might say, well, how could I kill another person defending myself? That seems to be way over the top. Well, it is over the top if it isn't required. The principle of self-defense arises simply from the instinctive reaction you have. If I go to strike you, you may put your hand up to stop me. If that's all that's required, that's all that's really allowed. But in the process of defending yourself, you might hurt my hand. And that's where we get into the problem of what happens to the aggressor. It may be that the degree of self-defense force required is so great that the aggressor is killed. We don't will it, but it is permitted, and it is licit to defend one's life to that extent. That doesn't mean you have to defend your life. That's another issue. The ethics is just filled with other issues. Every time you think you got something nailed down, there's some other principle you got to keep an eye on. And remember, we're trying to get the general principles here, see how they apply. But in principle, if you can put your hand up to block a blow, you have justified self-defense as far as it goes. You may use proportionate force. If someone is attacking you, you have the right to defend yourself against their aggressive attack. Now, the unborn child in the womb is not aggressively attacking anybody. But it is, you might say, well, is it a question of whether they're responsible for the attack? No, not always. Somebody who is completely insane may try to kill you. They are not morally responsible for their action. Nobody's blaming them. But materially, they are acting as an aggressor, and as such, you have the right to defend yourself against them. That's not the same thing as the unborn child who's doing nothing. But you can see how this can get complex. So in the case of self-defense, you are permitted to defend yourself to the extent required, but you may not go beyond that. So if it takes one shot to stop somebody, that doesn't mean you're allowed to empty the magazine. And even the law tends to frown on it, doesn't it? But self-defense is a good example because it is the basis, ultimately, for the next example which we're going to take, which is capital punishment. Does anybody have any questions about prior examples or the principles in general before we apply them to capital punishment?
What if you had a evil dentist who enjoys his patient's suffering, however, his tooth extraction is medically required, but he's delighted that he's...
You're not allowed to enjoy the negative effect on the recipient of your action.
So should he get into another business?
Because you're taking your, well, I don't know, maybe he enjoys that one, but in that case, the practitioner is taking delight in the suffering of another. That isn't permitted even where it's perfectly legitimate. Even if you have to kill somebody who's trying to kill you, you cannot take delight in the fact that you caused their death. You can take delight in the fact that they no longer threaten you. And of course, you get into very interesting situations. For example, what if somebody, you're in a life and death struggle with someone, and they're laying there on the ground, and you're completely exhausted, and you have a gun in your hand, and you realize if they get up once more, you're going to lose and get killed. What can you do? I think it's the same situation. You have the right to take care of them, extinguish their misery. Not because you would not be permitted to do that if you already have been able to overcome them and prevent the threat. But if you know the threat is about to come back, it's the same thing again. It's similarly, the question arises if somebody's walking up the street with a shotgun and they're about to shoot you, do you have to wait until they aim and pull the trigger before you defend yourself? Hardly. You recognize the threat in act as it is about to take place, and it would be foolhardy to wait for them to pull the trigger. So again, it gets a bit complex. But self-defense is the foundation for the analysis of capital punishment, which we're about to engage in. Dr. Waters has done tremendous work in the area of capital punishment. I don't know how many articles he wrote on it for the Social Justice Review, but
at least 5, maybe 5 to 8.
5 to 8 separate articles. I kept encouraging him to publish somewhere else. Talk about preaching to the choir, but I don't know anybody who in modern times has more thoroughly, exhaustively examined the question of capital punishment, more so than Dr. Rayful Waters, my longtime friend and colleague. And I dare say the important thing is that he did it correctly. There are a lot of people with big names who did it, but I would say they did it badly because they come to the wrong conclusion. There's a lot of distinctions have to be made here, and we're going to look at them as we proceed. There's no way I can give to you the thoroughness that Dr. Waters would have or did it when he taught this course before. But we will do the best that we can to try to handle some of the points entailed. And
just think, they only have up to page 10. So unfortunately, I don't have the page 11 for them that you'll be going from.
oh, okay.
I'll have it next week.
Well, I don't know. We'll see if we get there. I suspect we may, but perhaps not. I mean, the complexity of the issue of capital punishment, first of all, people have already formed opinions or judgments so that when you bring up the topic, you're already in the position in dealing with ethics that so often is the case, where there's more heat than light about to be shed. People sometimes argue vociferously. And we have to go back and remember what we said at the beginning of this course, that in ethics you try to find the truth, and you have to do so dispassionately. We will bring certain principles to bear. The complete analysis isn't had all at once. And it's possible for good people conceivably to disagree. What Dr. Waters particularly did that I have not seen done before, or if it was done, it was kind of glossed over, and that is he brought the application of the principle of double effect to this issue. I think you'll find Fagathy's Right and Reason, Gonsalves edition, one of the later editions of that ethics book, uses Dr. Waters' arguments. And I think he even uses it without attributing it to Dr. Waters at one point, but he does at a later point, I believe. Because the application of double effect here is rather unique. One of the problems that you have in ethics often is you'll see people arguing using very global kinds of arguments that don't really hit the nail on the head. So that they'll talk about general principles, and pretty soon you're wondering whether it's phenomenological soup that you're swimming through instead of metaphysical certitude. And so by applying the principle of double effect, I think you get a clarity to the question that otherwise would not be obtainable. Also, one of the confusions that arise to people today is because if they happen to be thinking about this in a Catholic context, they presume that the Pope John Paul II had condemned all capital punishment, and therefore that it's not licit to defend it somehow. And of course, one first of all has to distinguish between theology and philosophy, because that's theological and that's not doing it philosophically, which was what ethics is. And secondly, Dr. Waters went to great lengths to show that the teaching of the Catholic Church down through history has always absolutely defended in principle the legitimacy of capital punishment. And that would therefore have to include John Paul II. He had specific reservations. I think it was Cardinal Dulles who said that his final interpretation of what John Paul II was trying to say is that it should be done only very rarely, especially in modern society. And one could go along with that. That's because surely you don't want to be doing it willy-nilly. But on the other hand, when you talk about the advantages of modern society, what do you do when you're in a state of total warfare? What do you do when you're dealing with terrorists that permeate your society? So it may be that the Holy Father was thinking primarily in terms of a society in which law and order reigns in a very consistent way, and we have complete control of the situation. You certainly have a different context if a nation is fighting for its very life. So it's not that the end justifies the means, but the application of the justification for the use of a legitimate capital punishment would be more widely applicable. But we're not doing theology. Let's get back to the philosophy here and see where we go. The society has a right of self-defense, just as the individual has a right of self-defense. And what we really come back to here, kind of got to back this up a little bit, to the notion of law and the notion of sanction, because it's hard to understand how you could have something like the death penalty applied as a sanction if you haven't, first of all, talked a little bit about sanction. You can hardly have law if you don't have a way to enforce the law. Many times people would say, well, why pass the law? We're not enforcing it anyway, as an argument against it. No, okay, sometimes that's applicable, sometimes not. But generally speaking, if you're going to have a law, you have an applicable sanction. Sanction means either a reward for obeying the law or a punishment for violating it. Now, we also have a principle when it comes to sanction of due proportion, that the punishment should fit the crime. Now, sometimes people cite the Old Testament because it says an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But people don't realize that what that was doing is saying, look, don't overdo it. You know, don't chop off the guy's head for an eye. You know, just reduce it to an eye for an eye. And so it wasn't saying if somebody takes out your eye, you should take out his eye. It's not saying that at all. It was an attempt to ameliorate, to soften the application of law, not to make it more harsh. Unfortunately, in some Mideast countries, it is being used in this fashion. So if you're a thief, they will cut off your hand.
It's different now. Israel is using an eye for 1,000 eyes.
Pardon?
An eye for 1,000 eyes.
Due proportion, yes. Well, there was a case just a few months ago, I believe, where a woman had been blinded by somebody pouring acid in her eye. And the law permitted her to pour acid in his eye. And the only thing that saved him was that she finally decided she would not do it. But as far as the law was concerned, that was fine. So, but at any rate, the punishment should fit the crime. The reason, the due proportion principle, is quite evident. I mean, after all, if you have a parking violation and you really don't want people parking, we could tow the car, we could give you a $500 fine, or we could cut your head off. Now, what would deter you the most? I dare say that if you knew your head would be cut off for parking in the wrong place, you wouldn't park in the wrong place. But is that a just penalty? See, there's no proportion. Nobody would do that. Or they shouldn't do it, I would hope. Conversely, if you go out and engage in a lifestyle of a serial killer, should we give you a $5 fine? This is clearly absurd on the face of it. There has to be a proportion so that the greater the offense, the greater the penalty, the greater the sanction. And that's why, up to a certain point, we may fine you. We may actually put you in jail, take away your freedom. And that has relevance to capital punishment, by the way, as we'll see later on. And in a society, the point is that, you know, people do commit more and more serious offenses, and you come to a point at which you ask yourself, well, what can we do with this person? You can put them in jail for 5 years, 10 years, you can put them in for life, they get out on parole. You can put them in for life without parole, or you can, because their offense is so great, if it is a serious enough offense, remove them completely from society permanently. And that's where the death penalty comes in. The death penalty is complete removal of an impediment to the common good, because remember, we pass laws to promote and preserve the common good. Among the common goods are peace and tranquility and safety of property, safety of life. So we're going to pass laws. If you're going to threaten or take away our life, property, and limb, we will punish you for doing that. Society has a right to do it. Society has an obligation to do it, because society has to defend the lives and the values, the rights of its citizens. That's the basic structure that capital punishment arises out of. And it's not a matter of vengeance or revenge.
But that's a utilitarian argument, because you're presuming that the good of society, because they're a greater number, supersedes the good of an individual. And we're able to compromise the security and the life of an individual if they pose a threat to greater society.
But that would be to presume that you're violating a right on their part. It's a very different framework. You have to back up and look at the framework of how do you have society? How do you have a functioning society in which people can exercise their natural God-given rights? And that's the context in which law arises. And that's the context in which law requires sanction. It's not a matter of using somebody as a means to attaining a certain end, but it is rather a structure which is understood by everybody who is part of that society as a necessary consequence of the enactment of laws. What you're kind of getting at is the idea somehow you're violating this person's rights. The difficulty is that the lawbreaker has surrendered the rights that he possesses by violating the law. I mean, I could say, look, I parked in the wrong place. What right have you got to take $5 out of my pocket? But you know the judge will, won't he? And you know that it's perfectly legitimate. So you've got to go back and get the principle right. Are you using me as an evil means to prove to others that they should not park in the wrong place? No, you're simply enforcing the law. You're applying a sanction. Tiny, tiny sanction, but the principle is established. This is a big sanction for a big violation of law. But in the process of violating the law, you know, some people say, well, look, you're going to take the person's right to life. Okay. Well, how about my right to go where I want to go? Don't I have a free right to go any place I want to go? Well, if I go out and rob a bank, you know, one of the things you might do to me is put me in a jail cell. You've taken away my right to walk where I want to go. You see, the exercise of rights is correlative to the use of the person's reason properly in the exercise of those rights. If somebody chooses to violate the order of right reason and do evil things, they abrogate their own exercise of their rights in the process. People can see that clearly when you talk about parking fines and putting them in jail for drunken disorderly conduct. But when it comes to capital punishment, oh no, it's a different ballgame. No, it's the same ballgame. It's the same structure. It's what is consequent upon having a social organization, a society which is going to promote the common good, meet the common good by establishing that if you violate a law, that the judge will reestablish the order and balance of society by giving you the proper sanction for having violated the law. What we're talking about is the degrees of sanction now. See, you've got to decide what is the principle you're arguing about. Are you arguing about whether there should be sanctions, or are you objecting to this particular sanction? The sanction is so ultimate that people get all wrapped up in the sanction at that level and forget that it's part of a total project, a total context of having a society, of having laws, of being able to maintain order and justice and the common good of everybody in that society. If you can understand it in small things, this is simply the application of the same principle to a more serious context. So it's not utilitarianism. The act of taking the guilty man's life is not violence. Violence is an unjust act. It is force. The police use force, and everybody understands that. If you're in the middle of a bank robbery, nobody says to the police, don't shoot the guy who's trying to rob the bank. No, we call the police. We expect them to use the force we may not be up to using. And that's perfectly legitimate. Again, we've got to get the context.
Why is it illegitimate?
Why is it legitimate for the police to defend the common good of peace and tranquility and the money, my money that's in the bank?
What is the basis for that legitimacy that the police have the right or the freedom to shoot somebody who's robbing a bank? What's the philosophical legitimacy behind that?
Well, the basis, again, is that you have a system of laws which protects people's rights. What you're looking at there is property rights.
But that's a positivist approach. That's saying that any law that's on the books is a moral right. What we're trying to get at is what's the philosophical basis?
No,
we're not interested in what's enacted by the political authorities, because laws can be unjust.
Oh, granted. So obviously we are presuming that the police are enforcing just laws.
And they're doing it proportionately too.
Yeah,
because they can't
They
just
can abuse their
pull out a gun and
Sure.
shoot you at the bank.
Yeah, absolutely. If they can stop the offender by lesser means, they must. They can taser him if they can. So no, it goes without saying in all of these contexts. Again, See, that's what's tricky about ethics. You gotta always remember, you got other principles that you have to always apply. And that one of the principles always is that you never use more force than is required for self-defense. The police are engaged in self-defense of society. They have been appointed by the society to act on the basis of self-defense against the violation of rights of society individually and collectively. And those rights, the right to pursue the common good with peace and tranquility. And if it takes force to do that, it may be necessary. I mean, ultimately, this is simply a little subdivision of the right of a society to defend itself by war. You see, whether you're talking about just warding off somebody who's trying to hit you like this, or whether you're talking about massive warfare, it's the same principle. It's the same thing. If you can justify one, you can justify the other.
The difference is, though, is that there's an alternative in the capital punishment situations. It goes back to what you just mentioned a moment ago, is that society shouldn't use an excessive amount of force
Okay, I
to
agree.
protect itself.
I agree.
And if they can incarcerate the individual for an indefinite period indeterminately, then, you know, in a state of war, that's not always an option, because you've got an enemy that's confronting you. It's like a street situation. Somebody's lunging at
Granted,
you. The only
but in the case of warfare, you're also going to kill innocent people. That also is a side effect of it.
And also criminals operate right inside of prisons. They're known, so that's another
right,
argument.
it's another, I wasn't ready to go to your argument there, because I realize you say there are alternatives. All right, that's legitimate. If you can find an alternative, have it. The question, though, is whether there is an alternative to capital punishment in some cases. And of course, I understand that people would say, well, just, put them in jail forever. That's good enough. We'll have to take a look a little bit down the road here to see whether that is good enough. But again, most of these objections are self-answering. You can only use proportionate force. You never can overdo it. You can't take joy in causing evil. But I want you to focus on the global picture. What are we trying to do here? We're trying to maximize the good. And the good is not just the good of the individual, but it's the good of society as a whole. And if you're going to have society as a whole, it is necessary to have some kind of rule and order so that one person doesn't violate the rights of another. Thus, we give rise to the notion of just law. And if you're going to have laws, you've got to have sanctions. If you've got to have sanctions, you see where the rest of the logic goes. Now, that might or may not get all the way to capital punishment, but that's the general framework that we're looking at. If we don't see the general framework and get all wrapped up in the particular case and the emotion that's tied to the idea of dropping the pellets on somebody who's going to be put to death, we can lose sight of the principles. It is the philosophical principles that we need to defend, but we have to do it from the right end. You have to do it from the foundations upward, and the foundations are tied to the notion of law, the notion of sanction. And sanctions can entail penalties. And when you talk about penalties, they may be slight, or they may be great, or they may be greater. I mean, sometimes one of the biggest objections to capital punishment is, you killed an innocent man. Well, that's really too bad, isn't it? Well, the fact is, first of all, you should do all in your power not to do it. I'd be perfectly happy to say if you're going to have capital punishment, it better be left to those cases where there isn't any doubt at all. Don't give me some marginal case where somebody didn't do DNA printing or something, or we had 6 eyewitnesses and half of them recanted. Don't give me those cases. Those are not the kind of cases we should be talking about. What we're talking about is, in principle, can you justify capital punishment? And therefore, that we have a perfect right to pick the pure case, the perfect case, undoubted guilt. And if you say, well, if you make a mistake, I'm kind of granting against my own argument. If you make a mistake, you've killed him. You've taken away some, this incredible right to life. Well, they don't have the right anymore. They have forfeited it. which we've already discussed, but you've taken away the right to, okay, just give him life imprisonment instead. For heaven's sakes, isn't that horrible? You put a person into a cell for the rest of his life and he's innocent? That's horrible too. In other words, you're comparing one horrible thing to another. If you're going to say, well, we should never do anything to an innocent person wrongly, just what you're telling me is let's step outside of humanity. We're not going to have any laws because we as human beings are the ones who must exercise or execute the law, and yes, mistakes will occur. Innocent people will suffer. If you have an atheistic perspective, I suppose that's really irredeemable. But from a theistic perspective, this life is not the be-all and end of all of your life. And the worst thing that happens, as St. Thomas says, at least the person who's executed has time to prepare. You're shortening their entry into eternity. We're all going to enter eternity pretty quickly, faster than we expect. So this person will go a little bit more quickly than he expects. And I mean, it's a tremendous thing if he can accept this as the will of God, because it can't be averted. But if the alternative is to do away with the punishment entirely, we are taking away from society what may be a very legitimate and necessary means of self-defense in some extreme cases.
So, Dr. Bonnette, then, are you, I know you haven't really touched on this, but would you say that in modern day you can find cases where capital punishment is justified?
I would say that you have to be very careful to create a society in which you don't have capital punishment on the books, as you really leave society in a defenseless position. And you suddenly, what always happens, is when people say, oh, good, we got rid of capital punishment, we're kindly souls, everything's wonderful, and then you pick up the newspaper, you read the headlines and find out somebody did something you just didn't think anybody could do. And you say, by golly, they should put him, oh, we can't put him to death, we got rid of the law. See? What do you do? I mean, you think about somebody killing one person in a bar fight. Well, what do you do with the people that brought down the World Trade Center? Where's your due proportion? If you're going to give somebody life imprisonment for deliberate murder of one person, what do you do with somebody who kills 3,000? But I'm still just trying to apply this little chart we have here. I didn't even get that done. See, this is what capital punishment does to people. We get running off into the emotions of it and don't analyze it step by step. And everybody wants to, with every argument, everybody wants to go to the conclusion. We're still sorting through the application of the principles. I've got a couple pages here to go through. So let's go back. First of all, look at the chart describing the act. The act of capital punishment formally is removal. Now, materially, it could be done by the guillotine, it could be done by poison pills, it could be done in all kinds of different ways. What you are doing is completely removing somebody from society. Now, what does that mean? The basic difficulty is this. As long as they're alive, they're in society. They may be locked up like Manson in a jail cell, supposedly solitary, and he manages to arrange for another murder. But he's occupying a relationship to society by his very life. He's being fed. We're paying for him. We're paying the guards. The guards are interacting with him. So don't say he's completely removed from society. Complete removal from society means no longer being part of society. And there's only one way we know to do that, and that's to remove the form from the matter. To remove, for those who aren't familiar with hylomorphism, the soul from the body. And that's what execution does. It is an act of removing the soul from the body, which is a total removal of the person from society. That's the formal character of the act. The material character may be electrocution, it may be gas, it may be lethal injection, what have you. And what you're doing is you're removing this is the only justification, you're removing a serious, this guy's really made himself a serious impediment to the common good. A serious impediment. Remember, too, the purpose of law here, what you're doing is when a person violates the law, they have upset this balance of justice. You know, you see the picture of the lady justice holding those scales. Those scales, that's a balance. As long as people obey the law, there's a balance and a harmony and a common good that is preserved. When they violate the law, the scales get out of balance. And the purpose of the sanction is to put them back into balance. And it's retrospective. It's because of something somebody did, not because of what they will do. It's because of what they have done. And so this is retributive justice. This is putting the scales back into balance that we're talking about. And by restoring that balance, you have removed what would be an impediment to the common good. The impediment being that the scales stay out of balance. Somebody violated the law, and there was not a due and proportionate penalty applied. And you can't have law if you do not have sanctions, and the sanctions are meaningless if they are not enforced. That's the general framework. Now, two effects come from removing the person. The good effect is the restoration of peace and order, as we've already indicated. The evil effect, and it is an evil effect, is the loss of that person's life. And remember, because of the principle of double effect, we cannot take delight in that evil effect. You can't go have a hanging party. You know, in the Old West, the people used to come out, bring the wife and kids, we're gonna have a hanging. You know, somebody pop the popcorn, and we'll have some hot dogs. This will be a great thing. You know, it's like Madame Defarge at the guillotine, happily knitting away. No, this is not permissible. One may not take delight in the execution of the person. One can take delight that justice was served. One can take delight in the thought that this person will never hurt anybody else again. That's all right. But you can't take pleasure in the actual suffering of the person himself, as hard and tempting as that may be. That's what we call revenge. Revenge is to enjoy the evil that is visited upon another. We're never permitted to enjoy evil because then our will would be oriented towards evil. The will must always be oriented towards good in ethics, in law, in everything. By the way, the context in St. Thomas, if you want to look at where he talks the most about capital punishment and everything pertaining to it, is the Summa Theologiae Secunda Secundae, the second part of the second part, Article 64, or question 64, Article 2, Article 1 and 2. Secunda Secunda, question 64, Articles 1 and 2. And remember, society has, those who govern society have an obligation to defend society.
Wait, who has that obligation?
Those who have authority, those who govern, have an obligation. I may personally say, you want to attack me and kill me with a butcher knife. I can let you do it. That's okay. But if I'm the governor of a state and you're going to do this, I can't let you do it, because I am obliged to enforce the law. So as an individual, I can let you break the law against me, but as somebody in authority can't do that. And in the Summa Theologiae, in the Secunda Secunda, question 64, Article 2, St. Thomas argues that some men act below the beast. And you might say, well, what difference does that make? Well, the point is that your person Your rights that you possess as a person are premised on the fact that you are acting in accordance with your dignity as a human being. And your dignity as a human being is fulfilled only when you act according to reason. And that's why if you act irrationally and violate other people's rights, it's game over for you having total defense of an innocent person. And that's why we can fine you. And that's why we can take away your liberty in a jail cell. And that's why even your right to life, although you possess it, your right to exercise that right can get suspended permanently. Just like your right to walk around freely can be suspended permanently in a jail cell. In principle, it's no different. The difference is the nature of the punishment. All punishment has, and this is important, 3 aspects. First aspect is retribution. That is the restoration of the balance of order and justice, which is what we've been talking about right along. Retributive justice. Now, people get that confused with revenge. Revenge is enjoying causing evil to another person, getting back at them, ad personam, ad hominem, going after this guy. You want to get him personally. You're going to take delight in doing it. That is not what is permitted in justice. Justice is an act of retribution whereby the order and balance of right and justice within society is restored because it has been violated by somebody who has abdicated his rights or the exercise of his rights as an honorable, reasonable, virtuous person. We don't punish every vice. We don't punish every sin. Laws are enacted only to deal with things that are, relatively important. You might say, well, how about where I park my car? Well, it's a pain not to be able to get a parking space in some cases. We have to have some rules to sort it out. The justification for capital punishment, remember, 150 years ago, you steal my horse, we hang you. Today, you steal my horse. Well, okay, you stole my horse. It's sort of like stealing a car, only not as bad usually, unless it's a thoroughbred racer. But the reason that we hanged you, that's a proper term too. The reason we hanged you is because 150 years ago, you needed that horse to live. So it was a good equivalent to life. The application of capital punishment can apply to things that are either life itself or a good equivalent to life. When the horse ceased to be a good equivalent to life, it ceased to be a justification for hanging anybody. 2 other aspects of punishment: correction, rehabilitation, and deterrence. Now, many people get all wrapped up with capital punishment because they get wrapped up with the notion of correction and deterrence. Correction is perfectly legitimate. We want to rehabilitate the offender if it's possible. We want to deter others from committing a crime. But here is the problem. Retribution deals with the past. Retribution deals with what the person has already done. It's a fact. It's reality. It's happened. This person slit the throat of 3 innocent children. That's real. It's happened. Correction, rehabilitation, has to do with future acts not yet performed. Deterrence has to do with the future acts of other people not yet performed. That's why the essence of punishment is retribution, not correction and not deterrence. That may be an added purpose I mean, it's well and good. If you can rehabilitate the offender, fine. You know, we don't want him to go out and start doing it again if he's been in jail for 7 years or something. We don't want to release him to do it again. We try to rehabilitate him. If we can set an example to scare other people to not do things, that's fine. But you can't punish somebody more than he deserves to be punished in order to set an example for others. Because then you'd be using him as a means to an end, and you can't use a person as a means. But if the punishment does deter others, fine. That's wonderful. You don't want people committing crimes. I mean, if you want to publicize the fact that this guy got 7 years in jail, okay, that's a deterrence. That's fine. So you can't punish merely to deter others. Otherwise, you're using them as a means, and man as a person is not simply a means. I find I have some notes here, and I'm not quite sure how to organize them. For society to fail to punish the guilty, to fail to punish those who are threatening society by violating its laws, that is wrong on the part of society. Society doesn't have that option. Just so I don't skip this next time, we were talking earlier about the church approval of capital punishment. I'm thinking particularly of an article that Dr. Waters wrote in the Social Justice Review in August of 2002, pages 111 to 116, where he gives all of the historical precedents within the history of the church for capital punishment. And of course, the classic example that people raise against it in terms of revelation, and I know you already know this because Dr. Waters covered it very well, and that is the fifth commandment in Exodus 20, which says, people will frequently quote it as saying, "Thou shalt not kill." And indeed, several of the present English translations say, "Thou shalt not kill." I believe the Oxford edition doesn't. But the correct translation is, "Thou shalt not do murder." And that is easily demonstrated because if you look at Exodus 21 and 22, you'll find a whole bunch of examples where it says that these are things that people are supposed to be put to death for. So obviously, if there was a prohibition against capital punishment, you wouldn't have the next two chapters of the Bible giving you lists of cases where capital punishment is to be applied. So the proper translation is, "Thou shalt not do murder," murder being the deliberate and unauthorized taking of an innocent human life. Watch all those terms: deliberate, unauthorized, and the victim is innocent. That's murder. That's what's forbidden by the fifth commandment. It does not forbid the deliberate, authorized taking of a guilty human being's life. Very different.
I'm sorry, did you say what verse that was in Exodus? Where?
Exodus 20 has the 10 Commandments. Exodus 21 and 22 has the cases where capital punishment is ordered. So the purpose which is served by capital punishment, or for that matter, well, for capital punishment directly, is the purpose that is served is the restoration of peace and order, which comes from the legitimate moral act of removing somebody from society who is acting as an impediment to that order. And obviously it has to be a case in which capital punishment is the only legitimate or the only alternative that is functional. So yes, if you had a lesser alternative, well and good. But traditionally, And with good cause, societies have always had capital punishment. In modern times, some have sought to eliminate them. You probably know the role that Senator Dale Volcker, here in Western New York, played for many years in defending capital punishment. And I remember we had a symposium at Niagara University on capital punishment, and Senator Volcker was there, and he told us that he was out at, I think it was Attica, talking to a couple of the inmates there, and they had a reporter there. And while the reporter was there, the inmates kept saying, you know, I would consider it much worse to be locked up for life than to have to be executed. And so the reporter takes this down and dutifully goes off and tells people, well, you know, locking them up for life, it's worse than execution. Well, as soon as the reporter left the scene, those same inmates turned to Senator Volcker and said, well, you know, he pushed him again, and they said, well, of course we're afraid of being executed. Of course it's worse. Well, why did you say that? Well, the reporter was here. So that indicates, obviously it's anecdotal, but it's an indication that, yes, it is a further degree of punishment, which is possible. George?
Yeah, a question technically, or not a question so much as a comment, but that's another distraction, actually, because society should not be concerned with how awful the punishment is, simply does it fit the crime?
Right.
And
right.
The question, if capital punishment is so much more or less worse than life imprisonment, that should not be a factor.
Well, besides that, you're allowing the inmates and the people that are guilty to decide the punishment. So there's a lot wrong with that. That's true. Absolutely correct. No, the only question is this a necessary act of removal in order to defend society properly and to defend society's laws? But it's precisely, I mean, it's very easy to say, let's be humane, let's get rid of the capital punishment. The other side of the coin has to be looked at. There are many authorities who would say that it is a serious matter for rulers to remove capital punishment, to do away with it, because when you do away with it, you have restructured society in a different way. And heaven help you if you don't have it right. It's easy to pass laws. I mean, just like the one we just passed regarding same-sex marriage. Sure, you can enact a law, but the measure of the validity of a law is the justice of the law. Man doesn't make up the law. Positive law, yes, but only to the extent that it conforms to and reinforces natural law. In the Summa Contra Gentiles, Book 3, Chapter 146, St. Thomas argues that rehabilitation is a frivolous argument because it sacrifices the good of the many for the good of the one. And besides that, we don't, again, you look at this as an atheist, this won't make sense to you, but he says if repentance is ever to be obtained, it will come when somebody's facing sure death.
That's true.
And as I mentioned before, even in solitary confinement, one gets the benefits of society. You have human contact, you got a food, you got a bed, you got a roof.
Ping
Ping-pong, TV, pornography, whatever you want. I mean, when one talks about locking somebody up for life, I mean, if you really want to do it effectively, this is horrendous, but I'm thinking of a case maybe 30 years ago where somebody in some Latin American country where the rulers condemned somebody to being walled up, you know, Edgar Allan Poe style. And they did. They just sealed them in, sealed the concrete. They were on the other side. That's life imprisonment without parole.
So the assumption is, in order for this to be moral, if I follow the line of reasoning, it has to be applied justly.
Right.
It has to be proportional.
Right. It's got to be an outrageous crime, in other words, that you're dealing with. It can't, and that is why many of the examples you see where people say, well, this shouldn't have happened, are examples where it shouldn't have happened, where the crime was not sufficient, or there was possibility of doubt about the justice of the verdict.
So it has to be applied justly, proportionally, and you can't revel in it, you can't take delight.
No.
So on a practical level, which state in this world, which country, would you entrust that responsibility?
That's the objection, of course. I think in large measure, which many people today challenge the use of the justice system. They would say in the United States, we don't do it justly. We don't have a system that works adequately to justify it. And that's why I'm not trying to say here is a particular state in which it is done legitimately. I'm not saying it should be done in Texas but not New York. I'm simply saying in principle it ought to be done and ought to be done correctly. If you can't get a system where it's done justly, then you can't justify it. And I think that in large measure is the reason a lot of people who in principle approve of capital punishment in practice would reject it, because they would say we can't apply it, we're not doing it correctly, we haven't the ability, and that's a perfectly legitimate objection. If you could set up a system that was, really perfect, that would be fine. Now, the problem is we are too well aware of the defects in our own criminal justice system, and that's a legitimate objection. What can one say? But that doesn't mean in principle it is wrong. And also, bear in mind that even though that may be a good objection to ordinary civil crimes that we think of people committing, that doesn't handle the question of what do you do in time of war. It doesn't handle the question of what do you do when you have organized terrorists operating within your society. You may find that the context is such that justice, remember, also has to take into account the impact on society as a whole. And what you're saying when you say the system isn't working right is you're saying there is a greater likelihood of an innocent person being put to death. And we take that as a absolute. You just can't have a system that ever puts an innocent person to death. Well, I've already dealt with that. Law sometimes does adjudge the innocent guilty. And that is unfortunate. But what is more unfortunate would be to not have a system of law. If I get a parking ticket that I didn't deserve, I'm upset about it, but I understand you still got to have tickets given out, you still got to have parking, you still got to have cops giving out fines for speeding and so forth. So it's much the same thing. So
in a sense, it's tyranny is better than anarchy.
No, because to come back to your question of the criminal justice system not being applied perfectly, I'm trying to address that. That all other things being equal, that might be a legitimate reason for objecting. But if you are in a state of warfare where the very stability of society itself is at issue, then the very fact that you have a system that's a little creaky and rusty and doesn't work right all the time is not a sufficient reason, perhaps, to not use it. Because we have to realize, even when you have an extremely good system, it is possible that an innocent person be convicted. In other words, the argument that you should do away with the system because an innocent person can be convicted is not a legitimate argument, because everybody who's in jail anywhere is innocent. Just ask them.
I wasn't referring to the inadvertencies or inefficiencies, the practical kind of administrative hiccups along the way that may pervert a case. I'm talking about the abuse of that power. I'm talking about which country in the world, which state would you confer that immense amount of responsibility to be able to determine who to put to death and who not to.
I don't get to
What state in the world will not abuse that power?
I don't get to confer it, but I wouldn't presume that every state would abuse it. I think it depends upon the people who create the state. And therefore, what we're looking at is, in principle, is it possible? And I would say even if one objected to the criminal justice system in this country as it presently stands and use that as an argument against capital punishment at this moment for most ordinary crime, even horrible murder and mayhem, I think that in this country, if you were in a state of quasi-insurrection, that the fact that the system is not perfect would not be a legitimate objection to using it. Because
So the state should use
Rem-
murder.
remember,
to-
no,
to
the state
preserve
can't use
itself.
murder. Nobody's saying that.
But
What we're
if the
talking
state
about,
was threatened, if the apparatus of power
That would
in
be
this
a-
country was threatened.
that would be a total perversion of the system. We're talking about the use of a criminal justice system. You're talking about the fact that it may not work well for multitude of reasons. I'm just saying, okay, if you think it doesn't work that well, that might be a legitimate reason for saying, let's not have capital punishment at this point in time in our society. But what I'm saying is if society as a whole is threatened, then the game changes, because there is an obligation of society to protect everybody. And all that you're really saying when you say the system doesn't work very well is you realize that you're going to get more innocent people killed, and you don't want that to happen. So you say, okay, well, we won't do it under the present circumstance. What I'm saying is, since capital punishment in principle is licit, this option could be reversed in contexts where society's very existence is at stake. So you could afford to be benevolent, perhaps, at present. And I think to a large measure, that's what John Paul II was trying to get at. He's trying to say in a modern society, we have other means, we can avoid this in general, but that's what Cardinal Dulles said. Well, what he meant is it should be used, but rarely. But that's why the church has never said that capital punishment is illicit. It has always defended that in principle it is licit. So you have to distinguish between practical contexts which make it hard to apply and saying that in principle it is not licit. What I am defending here, what Dr. Waters was defending, is that in principle it is licit. That's all. Now, we have a few more points we could make here, but I don't have time tonight to make them, so we'll have to adjourn.
Sound production copyright Olteen Library Services 2013. All rights reserved. www.aquinasphilosophy.com.